I want to know, what is your answer to young people for some of the really big problems facing humanity, like the climate catastrophe, like economic crisis, like the precarious job market? Because I just don't, you talk all this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal politely. I would consider that more of an opinionated personal and political statement than actually a question. So why don't you try reformulating that so that there's an actual question there?
So what is your advice to young people when you talk about you need to be individually responsible, but when there are things that are so far out of our control, like climate catastrophe, like the precarious job economy, like the economic crisis?
Out of your control as you think.
What is your answer to
Do you think that you're worse off than
you
think that you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think there are different challenges.
Do you think you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think that
Jordan, once again, we're not going to cross-examine our question.
Fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, and then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions. I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world, which happens in many ways. I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors. That's what it looks like.
Let's assume for a moment that I've benefited from my white privilege. To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's specialized for me so that I can account for my damn privilege, so that I can stop hearing about it?
Right. This is what I'm saying to you. Why the rage, bruh? You're doing well, but you're a mean, mad white man, and you're going to get us right.
And with regards to my privilege or lack thereof, I mean, I'm not making the case that I haven't had advantages in my life and disadvantages in my life like most people. You don't know anything about my background or where I came from, and it doesn't matter to you because fundamentally I'm a mean white man. That's a hell of a thing to say in a debate.
The mean, mad white comment was not predicated upon my historical excavation of your past. It's based upon the evident vitriol with which you speak and the denial of a sense of equanimity among combatants in an argument. So I'm saying again, you're a mean, mad white man, and the viciousness is evident.
Okay. It's conceivable that I am a mean man. I mean, maybe I'm meaner than some people and not as mean as others. I think that's probably more the case. But I would say the fact that race got dragged into that particular comment is a better exemplar of what the hell I think is wrong with the politically correct left than anything else that could have possibly happened.
It's not about masculinity per se. You must know that.
I read the American Psychological Association guidelines for the treatment of boys and men, and I know perfectly well that this is no straw man. The first thing I would say is that I'm not anti-feminist per se. I mean, I think the idea that the world would benefit from the movement of talent from both sexes into the workplace as rapidly as possible is something that anyone with any sense should share, given the the rarity of talent and the necessity for utilizing it. I do stand by my original statement, though, that there's a brand of more radical feminism that insists that our culture is best characterized as an oppressive patriarchy, and I think that, first of all, that's an appalling sociological doctrine, and I think it has very negative psychological effects. And they won't be limited to men, because if it's true that there's something toxic, let's say, about masculinity per se, what that will inevitably mean is that as women adopt more masculine roles, traditionally, what is that toxicity somehow going to go away?
But that's a straw man, because no one says there's anything toxic about masculinity per se.
What do you mean no one says that? The
use-
term exists.
No,
How is that a straw man? But where did the term come
It's a phrase
from?
that's used about forms of masculinity that are harmful to men and women. It's not about masculinity per se. You must know that.
I
to
read the
argue
American
about this.
Psychological Association guidelines for the treatment of boys and men, and I know perfectly well that this is no straw man. And it's not only devoted towards what you might describe as the more aggressive ends of masculine behavior. It's aimed at masculinity in a much broader range of. There's a much broader range of accusations that are under the surface than that. And so I don't see in what way at all that it's a straw man.
I'm just going to pause that argument for a second
disagree, I
and
think,
go
on that.
to...
You also talk about the importance of the Bible, in which women are deemed subservient.
No, they're not. That's complete rubbish. I'm not saying we replace female chaos with male order. First of all, I'm not saying that chaos is female. I said it was symbolically feminine. And that's not the same thing at all.
Now this, to me, seems like a different thing from what you were saying before. And it's just in the manner that you're expressing yourself now. I think it's much clearer now what you are actually against, and how you see these male-female dynamics.
Well, the funny thing is, it's that I'm not so much against. You know, this is why interviews are so strange. Mm-hmm. When I do my lectures, I don't talk politically. I'm not against things. I'm for individual people.
So
get out there, do your best, tell the truth, set the world in order, have a family, accept some responsibility, fix up your community, and take the beam out of your own eye before you worry about the mote in your neighbors.
Yeah. And I like that part of 12 rules and of everything that you're saying. But then there seems to be this other side, or it comes out in interviews sometimes, but it's also in 12 rules, where you equate the feminine with chaos.
I don't do that.
No,
that's
I know,
ridiculous.
I know.
The Taoists have done that for 3,000 years.
I know, but
right, it's not me.
No.
Right.
But you're selecting, right? You write a book which is an antidote to chaos, and you're selecting the stories in which the feminine is chaos, and also I'm
observing and collecting the stories.
But it's adding up, right? So you also talk about the importance of the Bible, in which women are deemed subservient.
No, they're not. That's complete rubbish. How in the world could you possibly derive that idea from biblical readings? The most fundamental statement in the Bible, and this is a miraculous statement, it's absolutely incomprehensible that it was written some thousands of years ago. Men and women are made in the image of God. Not men. Men and women.
But you know that there's also passages in there which do posit the woman as subservient.
What passages are you referring to?
Well, where it's told to Adam and Eve that women will henceforth have to obey their husband.
Well,
that
wasn't a divine injunction. It was a terrible warning.
Okay,
it wasn't a statement about how society should be structured. It was a statement about the inevitability of that happening, because women were going to be vulnerable in pregnancy and in child raising.
Now I understand your interpretation. You're interpreting the Bible and you're interpreting Nietzsche and bringing it all together. It's fine that you're doing that in your way, but can you understand that to women it may feel like you are against them?
What do you mean? It may feel to women like there's no injunction in that story.
No, but
That
generally,
men have the right to lord it over women.
No,
it's not in the story.
It's not just this story, of course. You know, as
But
I
what
as
is
I
it?
said,
There's heroic females in the entire corpus of the Old Testament, and there's no evidence whatsoever throughout the biblical corpus that women are any less worthy of the kingdom of God than men. And so this is part of the same thing. There's the pervasive notion that even the fundamental documents of Western civilization have this inbuilt patriarchal bias. Look, as far as I'm concerned, that statement that men and women are both made in the image of God, which gives them each a spark of divinity, out of that tiny little statement grew the entire idea of individual human rights. The idea that the state couldn't impose its purview past a certain limit, and that idea grew over thousands of years to provide the relatively free society that we have now. And to assume that that is associated in some manner with patriarchal oppression, especially given the time when that was written, is just think about how unlikely it was that long ago those words were penned.
But Jordan, please listen to the question that I'm trying to pose, and it's not about this, it's about everything adding up, and that makes women feel that somehow you are against them. And wait a minute before you answer, because you're all about taking responsibility, and that it's very important to look at the consequences of what we do. And somehow a lot of women feel like you're against them. So what's going on there? What's your responsibility here?
You have no evidence whatsoever of what proportion of the people who are watching my videos or listening to my podcasts or reading my books who are women feel that way. Your accusations are purely speculative.
It's not. It's not an accusation.
Sure,
it's just an observation. It was
but an observation based on what?
Well,
I have women I have dozens of women, hundreds of women who've written me letters thanking me for the books and for what they've done for their sons and for their husbands. And about 30% of the audiences to my shows are now women, and that's increasing as a consequence of the book.
Of course.
So I don't
not
buy
all
it.
women. Not all women.
Yeah, well, there's a small and unspecified percentage of women who may hold the perspective that you describe, but you have no idea what the percentage is, and you have no hard facts on it, and so there's no way of defending myself against it. And the idea that I happen to identify the feminine with chaos why is that a problem? Chaos is no worse than order. Order is tyranny. Chaos is possibility. The mere fact that people don't do a close enough reading to understand that these two powers are equally balanced, in that order can be security or tyranny, and that chaos can be potential or uncertainty. The fact that people aren't reading carefully enough to understand that is not my problem. They could read it carefully enough to understand that. And to say that that's a fabrication on my part is absolutely foolish. I mean, for 40 years, let's say the mystic left has been enamored of the Taoist philosophy. Well, the philosophy that I'm putting forward is the Taoist philosophy. So how in the world can that be laid at my feet? And it's certainly not the only example of the symbolic utilization of masculinity for order. Look at it this way. Why do you think the feminists assume that we live in a patriarchy if they're not identifying masculinity with order? That's what they're doing. Well, they're doing it symbolically. They don't understand. It's a symbolic issue.
Yeah, but Jordan, you've been asked this question before, but I didn't think your answer, I wasn't quite convinced yet. Your book is an antidote to chaos, and not an antidote to chaos and order, or not.
The next book's an antidote to order.
Yeah, it will be an antidote to order.
And the book isn't an antidote. The book is the antidote to chaos is not order.
No.
Right, that's not what the book's about. The antidote to chaos is the balance between order and chaos, right? And the book says that repeatedly. It's impossible to read it and actually read it and not to come away with the conclusion that the position that I'm adopting is that the meaningful place to stand in life is halfway in order and halfway in chaos. It's not a criticism of chaos, and it's not a criticism of order, except in the extremes. And the extremes are terrible in both directions, which is why the balance has to be there. And so I'm not saying we replace female chaos with male order. First of all, I'm not saying that chaos is female. I said it was symbolically feminine. And that's not the same thing at all. It's not even close to the same thing, because there's a difference between a symbol and something that's real. And because we have a gendered cognitive structure, we tend to view the world through gendered categories. And that's the categories that emerged. That's not my responsibility. Someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic. And it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies?
Do you see the ONS data that came out a couple of weeks ago that said for the first time ever since records began, 50.1% of women are childless by 30? So there are more women without children at 30 than there are women with children. The first time ever.
Well, somebody clipped a part of one of my podcasts, I believe it was, where I was talking about what our society does to 19-year-old women, or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women. We just lie to them all the time. You know, the first lie is, there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is, there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. So that's the second lie. And then the third lie is, there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted. And who are men to tell me what I can do with my body? And hey, fair enough, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've worked in female-dominated occupations my entire life. For example, I worked as a daycare worker way back when, that was like 1980, something like that. And there were no men doing that, but I really liked kids, and so that was fun. And I worked for social services in Alberta in the childcare department, and then I've been working as a psychologist, either training or as a psychologist since then, and that's been a female-dominated enterprise increasingly as the years went by. But even when I first entered it, so I'm in the post-female in the workplace generation firmly. I never experienced the world except as that, and so I've watched women progress through their professional careers at every level of attainment, from the lowest to the highest, and observed what happened, and relatively, I would say, bias-free, because I didn't know. And what I've seen is that as women progress towards their late 20s, there's a psychological transformation, and what happens is that they place less emphasis on their career and way more emphasis, particularly on having a child. And that really reaches a crisis point around 29 or 30 for the vast majority of women, and their attitude flips. And I've seen it flip very dramatically with many women. And I suppose the most convincing evidence of that, I worked with high-end lawyers in Toronto for about 10 years. I was part of an organization. We went to law firms, high-end law firms, and said, send us your most productive people, and we'll help them iron out whatever wrinkles there might still be in their life. And the advantage to them is that things will go better for them, and the advantage to you is they'll be even more productive. And there's a good management dictum, which is pay the most attention to your most productive people, because they're bringing in the bulk of your revenue disproportionately. And so I worked with men and women who were at the peak of their careers in a very difficult enterprise. And so these were women who were generally very attractive, well put together physically, pretty stable psychologically, extremely conscientious, very, very smart, and high achieving from like junior high all the way through high school, university, law school, onto the top firms, rocketing up through the ranks, full partnership by the time they were 29 or 30, and all the law firms, all the women bailed out, all of them. The law firms couldn't keep them. And I was really, and I talked to the women a lot about this because I was very interested in it, because I knew the law firms were bending themselves over backwards and tying themselves into knots trying to retain these women, because why wouldn't they? Just being greedy capitalists is enough. They don't want to lose their high-performing women because they're performing at the highest level, and they couldn't keep them. The women wanted to have 9-to-5 jobs. They wanted to bind the job so they could have a life, and that was especially true once they got interested in having a child or had one. And what they really came to was a very interesting realization. So because they were highly conscientious women, they sort of did their duty and worked hard and diligently and didn't pop their head up to ask questions. They were in junior high, they got the best grades. They were in high school, they got the best grades, and so on, all the way through, right till they reached partnership. But that's sort of an apogee, right? You hit partnership in a senior law firm, it's like you're at the top of your profession. Well, then what? Well, so then they looked around and they thought, here I am with all these like hyper-competitive men, perfectly willing to work 80 hours a week, nonstop, to stay at the top. What the hell are they doing? Because that's the real question. What is it that characterizes this small percentage of hyper-competitive men? It's not. You can assume that that's how everyone should be, but first of all, that isn't how everyone is. Or you can flip that and say, well, there's only a small minority of human beings that are willing to do this, to work flat out 8 hours a week. I mean, they're certainly being paid for it. Let's make no mistake about that. But well, what about the rest of life? Well, that's what the women asked. Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. Well, for men, there's a different answer than for women. It's a really different answer. And it isn't like the men are exactly thinking this through. It's more like this is an integral part of male motivation. The more successful you are as a man, the more women like you. I released a video. I was going to conclude that other story. I released a video, or someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic, and it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies? And I wasn't being judgmental. I was just saying exactly what I said to you, which is, well, I've watched women over the entire course of my life with, I would say, an affectionate eye. I love my sister, I love my wife, I have a daughter, I love my mother. I'm pretty happy about women, all things considered. I don't have an axe to grind in relationship to how they should conduct their lives. I don't even know how they should conduct their lives. I've watched what happens. And I've also watched what happens to women who hit 29 or 30 and then can't conceive. And that is not a fate I would wish on anyone. It's awful. And 30% of couples fall into that. 30% of couples have difficulty conceiving. It's a lot. And the probability that you'll have difficulty conceiving increases with age. And so, c'est la vie. But it's very interesting to me to see how vitriolic those comments have been and how uniform that is, because usually on my YouTube channel in particular, 95% of the comments are positive. And this is completely the opposite of that.